The acrid smell of machine oil and metal shavings filled the cramped workshop aboard HMS Victorious as Percival Thornfield's weathered hands moved with surgical precision across the Torpedoes' magnetic pistol. It was March 23, 1942, and the North Atlantic convoy battles were reaching their most desperate hour. His commanding officer had explicitly forbidden any modifications to the Mark 8 torpedo's firing mechanism, calling such tampering gross insubordination that would result in immediate court-martial. But Percival had watched 17 Allied merchant ships sink in the past 4 days while their submarine hunters fired torpedo after torpedo that either exploded prematurely, ran too deep, or passed harmlessly beneath enemy U-boats like expensive training rounds. The mathematics of failure had become unbearable. As he carefully rewired the magnetic influence exploder with components salvaged from a broken radio set, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the frigid March air seeping through the carrier's hull. His modification violated 3 separate Admiralty regulations, contradicted explicit orders from Captain Montague, and could theoretically cause the torpedo to detonate inside its own launch tube, killing him and half the crew instantly. But watching Allied sailors die while their weapons systematically failed had pushed him beyond the boundaries of military obedience into a realm where conscience demanded action, regardless of consequences. No one in the Royal Navy's torpedo branch knew that one machinist's defiance that morning would rewrite the mathematics of submarine warfare and transform the Battle of the Atlantic from a slow Allied defeat into the beginning of German naval collapse. Percival Hawthorne Thornfield had never intended to become a naval revolutionary. Born in the grimy industrial heart of Sheffield in 1908, he was the son of a steel foundry foreman who believed that precision in metalwork reflected precision of character. Young Percival displayed an almost supernatural ability to hear mechanical problems before they became visible, detecting worn bearings by the subtle change in their whir, identifying stress fractures by the way metal sang under pressure. At 14, he could disassemble and rebuild any engine in Sheffield faster than most certified mechanics, but more importantly, he could visualize how each component's failure would cascade through the entire system. When the Royal Navy established its technical training school in Portsmouth in 1926, Percival's headmaster personally recommended him for the program. The 18-year-old arrived at Portsmouth believing he would learn to maintain ship engines and return to Sheffield as a civilian contractor. He had no idea that his mechanical instincts would soon collide with the greatest technological crisis in naval warfare history, or that his willingness to ignore orders would determine whether Britain could continue importing the food and fuel necessary for national survival. The transition from civilian machinist to naval technician proved challenging. The Royal Navy's rigid hierarchy clashed with his Sheffield working-class directness, and his tendency to question the engineering logic behind official procedures immediately marked him as a troublemaker. During his first year at Portsmouth, he was written up 17 times for improper suggestions regarding approved maintenance protocols and twice for insubordinate questioning of superior officers' technical decisions. But his practical results spoke louder than his disciplinary record. When Lieutenant Commander Ashworth's destroyer developed a persistent engine vibration that had stumped 3 certified engineers, Percival identified a microscopic imbalance in the propeller shaft that was gradually destroying the entire power plant. When the fleet's torpedo maintenance crew struggled with consistently erratic detonation timing, Percival discovered that humidity variations were affecting the firing pin's strike velocity in ways that the weapons designers had never considered. By 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, Percival had earned advancement to Petty Officer First Class and assignment to the Royal Navy's most critical technical challenge, keeping the fleet's torpedo systems functioning in combat conditions that their peacetime designers had never anticipated. He had developed a reputation for mechanical intuition that bordered on precognition, but he had no idea that within 3 years, his willingness to ignore direct orders would prove the difference between Allied victory and German domination of the Atlantic sea lanes. The Battle of the Atlantic represented far more than a maritime conflict between opposing naval forces. By early 1942, German U-boat operations had reached a level of efficiency that threatened Britain's ability to continue fighting. Admiral Karl Dönitz's submarine fleet was sinking Allied merchant vessels faster than American and British shipyards could replace them, creating a mathematical progression that led directly toward British starvation and collapse. The numbers revealed the crisis's true scope. German submarines were destroying an average of 96 Allied ships per month, representing over 400,000 tons of desperately needed food, fuel, and military supplies. British food rationing had already reached subsistence levels, with civilians receiving less than 2,000 calories per day, and fuel shortages were forcing factory shutdowns across England's industrial heartland. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat represented the only enemy capability that genuinely terrified him, because unlike aerial bombing or ground invasion, submarine warfare could slowly strangle Britain without dramatic battles that might galvanize public resistance. The Royal Navy's response centered on convoy protection and aggressive submarine hunting, but their primary anti-submarine weapon, the torpedo, suffered from systematic failures that had plagued British naval operations since the war's beginning. Torpedo attacks that should have destroyed enemy submarines instead resulted in harmless explosions, erratic trajectories, or complete duds that alerted U-boat commanders to their hunter's presence while inflicting no damage whatsoever. The crisis had reached a point where British submarine commanders privately admitted they had more confidence in their deck guns than their primary weapons, a technological failure that effectively neutered the Royal Navy's submarine fleet during the Atlantic battle's most critical phase. The Torpedoes' problems stemmed from a fundamental design flaw that reflected peacetime engineering assumptions rather than combat realities. The Mark 8 torpedo's magnetic influence exploder was designed to detonate when the weapon passed through a ship's magnetic field, theoretically allowing it to explode beneath the target's hull where the blast would be most devastating. In controlled testing conditions, the system worked flawlessly, destroying target vessels with remarkable efficiency. But combat conditions in the North Atlantic bore no resemblance to the calm testing waters where the magnetic system had been perfected. The Earth's magnetic field varied significantly between Britain's testing ranges and the operational areas where submarines actually fought, causing magnetic pistols calibrated for English waters to function erratically when deployed near Greenland, Iceland, or the American coast. Temperature variations affected the magnetic sensor's sensitivity, creating a cascade of failures that manifested differently depending on sea conditions, target vessel construction, and even the time of year when attacks occurred. Worse, German naval intelligence had identified the magnetic exploder's vulnerability and begun installing degaussing equipment that deliberately distorted their vessels' magnetic signatures, rendering British torpedoes essentially useless against prepared enemies. The Admiralty's response was characteristically bureaucratic. Rather than authorizing field modifications that might solve the immediate problem, they established a committee to study the issue and issued strict orders forbidding any unauthorized changes to torpedo firing mechanisms. Meanwhile, German U-boats continued sinking Allied merchant vessels with devastating efficiency, while British submarines fired increasingly ineffective weapons that often revealed their positions without inflicting any damage in return. Percival first recognized the torpedo crisis's true scope during convoy duty in February 1942, when HMS Victorious encountered a German supply submarine refueling 3 U-boats southwest of Iceland. The tactical situation was ideal for a coordinated torpedo attack. Perfect weather, optimal range, and enemy vessels caught completely off guard while conducting vulnerable surface operations. Commander Ashworth ordered a 4-torpedo spread that should have destroyed all 4 German vessels within minutes. Percival watched from the carrier's observation deck as their torpedoes traced perfect trajectories toward the unsuspecting enemy formation. The first torpedo passed directly beneath the supply submarine's hull without detonating, its magnetic exploder apparently unresponsive to the target's metallic mass. The second torpedo struck the submarine's side with a metallic clang clearly audible across the water, but the contact exploder failed completely. The third torpedo exploded prematurely, detonating 50 yards short of its intended victim in a spectacular but useless display that accomplished nothing except alerting all 4 German vessels to their danger. The fourth torpedo ran too deep, passing beneath its target before disappearing into the Atlantic's depths as another expensive failure. Within minutes, all 4 German submarines had crash-dived and escaped, taking with them the knowledge of convoy routes that would enable them to sink dozens more Allied vessels in the coming weeks. Commander Ashworth's after-action report clinically described the engagement as tactically sound but compromised by torpedo malfunction. But Percival understood that they had just witnessed systematic weapon failure that was costing Allied lives every day. It remained unaddressed. His research revealed the magnetic exploder's fundamental engineering problem. The system had been calibrated for magnetic field conditions that existed near Britain but varied dramatically across the North Atlantic's operational areas. The Earth's magnetic field intensity decreased as one moved north toward Greenland, causing magnetic pistols to become increasingly insensitive until they required almost direct contact with enemy hulls before triggering. Conversely, magnetic anomalies near Iceland and the American coast could cause premature detonation at ranges where the explosion caused no damage while alerting enemy vessels to their attacker's presence. The contact exploder backup system suffered from different but equally critical flaws. The firing pin mechanism was too sensitive to minor impacts but insufficiently robust to guarantee detonation when striking armored targets at oblique angles. Temperature variations affected the firing pin's spring tension, creating seasonal reliability variations that explained why torpedo performance seemed to deteriorate during winter operations, when submarine warfare was most crucial. Most frustratingly, the magnetic and contact systems interfered with each other in ways that the original designers had never anticipated, creating feedback loops that could cause complete firing system failure even when individual components tested perfectly in isolation. Percival realized that solving the torpedo crisis would require unauthorized modifications to both exploder systems, changes that would violate multiple Admiralty regulations while potentially creating new failure modes that could prove even more dangerous than the existing problems. But watching Allied merchant sailors die while their protectors fired increasingly ineffective weapons had pushed him beyond concern for military regulations into a realm where results mattered more than proper procedures. The opportunity to implement his unauthorized modifications came during HMS Victorious's patrol assignment in early March 1942, when their battle group encountered intelligence reports of a major German submarine concentration preparing to attack the largest Atlantic convoy of the war. Convoy SC-94 contained 78 merchant vessels carrying over 500,000 tons of food, fuel, medical supplies, and military equipment desperately needed by Britain's war effort. Admiral Horton had deployed 12 submarines, 6 destroyers, and 3 aircraft carriers in the most comprehensive anti-submarine operation of the Atlantic campaign. With orders to locate and destroy the German submarine concentration before it could attack the convoy. But the operation's success depended entirely on torpedo effectiveness, and Percival knew from bitter experience that their weapons would likely fail at the moment when Allied naval supremacy hung in the balance. Captain Montague had personally inspected the torpedo storage areas 3 days earlier, explicitly ordering that no modifications be made to any weapons without direct authorization from the Admiralty. The captain's orders were unambiguous. Any sailor found tampering with torpedo systems will face immediate court-martial and criminal prosecution for endangering His Majesty's naval vessels. But Percival understood that following those orders would result in tactical failure that might prove strategically decisive, condemning Allied merchant sailors to death while German submarines escaped to continue their devastating Atlantic campaign. His first unauthorized modification addressed the magnetic exploder's sensitivity variations by installing a simple rheostat salvaged from a radio receiver, allowing manual adjustment of the magnetic sensor's trigger threshold based on local magnetic field conditions. The modification required rewiring the torpedo's firing circuit in a manner that violated 3 separate Admiralty specifications, but it would allow torpedo operators to compensate for magnetic field variations that rendered the standard system unreliable. His second modification replaced the contact exploder's temperamental firing pin mechanism with a more robust system built using components from a damaged depth charge, creating a backup detonation system that would function reliably even when the magnetic system failed completely. Most critically, his third modification synchronized the magnetic and contact systems to eliminate the feedback interference that was causing complete firing system failures. But this required installing a delay circuit that could theoretically prevent both systems from functioning if his electronic calculations contained any errors. Each modification violated explicit orders while creating new failure modes that could prove catastrophic. But Percival had concluded that systematic weapon failure represented a greater threat to Allied lives than the risks inherent in unauthorized improvements. He worked during night watches when official inspections were unlikely, using tools and components that he had carefully accumulated over several weeks, testing each circuit modification before installation in actual torpedo warheads. His hands remained steady despite the knowledge that a single wiring error could trigger an explosion that would kill him instantly while destroying a significant portion of HMS Victorious's forward sections. The first test of his modifications came at dawn on March 23, 1942, when HMS Victorious's sonar operators detected multiple submarine contacts bearing southeast toward convoy SC-94's projected route. Commander Ashworth ordered battle stations and prepared to execute a coordinated attack with HMS Furious and HMS Ark Royal, targeting what appeared to be at least 6 German submarines moving in a coordinated hunting formation. The tactical situation was ideal for a torpedo attack: calm seas, excellent visibility, and enemy submarines caught on the surface during their approach to attack positions. Percival monitored the torpedo room preparations with growing tension, knowing that his unauthorized modifications would either vindicate his decision to ignore direct orders or result in catastrophic failure that would end his naval career while potentially costing Allied lives. The torpedo crews loaded 6 Mark 8 torpedoes into the launch tubes, each weapon now equipped with Percival's unauthorized modifications that made them technically illegal armaments under Royal Navy regulations. Commander Ashworth's attack plan called for a precisely coordinated spread that would target the German submarine formation's lead elements, followed by a second attack on any surviving vessels that attempted to escape toward deeper water. The first torpedo launched at 0600 hours, its modified magnetic exploder correctly calibrated for the North Atlantic's magnetic field conditions. Percival watched the weapon's telemetry indicators, noting that his rheostat modification was functioning properly and maintaining sensor sensitivity within optimal parameters. The torpedo's track appeared straight and true, heading directly toward the lead German submarine at precisely the depth and speed that his calculations had predicted. Through HMS Victorious's periscope, Commander Ashworth reported that the weapon was approaching its target with textbook precision, but Percival knew that the real test would come when the magnetic exploder entered the submarine's magnetic field and either detonated properly or failed like so many previous attempts. The torpedo struck the submarine's magnetic field at a range of 12 feet, exactly where Percival had calculated optimal detonation should occur, and his modified magnetic sensor triggered the warhead with devastating effectiveness. The explosion lifted the German submarine's bow completely out of the water before breaking the vessel in half, creating a column of smoke and spray that was visible from 5 miles away. The second torpedo, launched 30 seconds later, performed identically, destroying another submarine with the kind of reliable efficiency that British torpedoes had not demonstrated since the war's beginning. Commander Ashworth's voice crackled over the intercom with barely contained excitement. "Direct hit. Target destroyed. Excellent shot." The third and fourth torpedoes continued the pattern, each weapon detonating with precision that proved his unauthorized changes had restored the Mark 8's combat effectiveness. Within 8 minutes, 4 German submarines had been destroyed with 4 torpedo shots, representing the kind of tactical success that Royal Navy operations had not achieved in months of Atlantic combat. The tactical consequences of successful torpedo performance extended far beyond the immediate destruction of enemy submarines. The remaining German vessels, shocked by the sudden annihilation of their formation's lead elements, abandoned their coordinated attack and scattered toward deep water in individual escape attempts that made them vulnerable to coordinated Allied pursuit. HMS Furious and HMS Ark Royal, emboldened by the demonstrated torpedo effectiveness, pressed their attacks with renewed confidence, knowing that their weapons would function reliably when they achieved firing positions. Within 2 hours, the entire German submarine concentration had been destroyed or driven from the area, removing the threat to convoy SC-94 while demonstrating Allied naval capability in a manner that would reshape German tactical planning. The convoy reached Britain without losing a single vessel, delivering over 500,000 tons of desperately needed supplies, while proving that Allied naval forces could protect merchant shipping when their weapons functioned properly. Word of the torpedo modifications spread quickly through the Royal Navy's technical community as torpedo crews on other vessels began implementing similar changes based on detailed reports from HMS Victorious's engineering staff. Within 6 weeks, unauthorized torpedo modifications had been adopted throughout the Atlantic Fleet, restoring British submarine and destroyer effectiveness to levels that fundamentally altered the battle of the Atlantic's strategic balance. But Percival's unauthorized modifications had not gone unnoticed by HMS Victorious's command structure. Captain Montague's investigation into the sudden improvement in torpedo performance quickly identified the illegal changes that violated his explicit orders regarding weapon modifications. The captain faced a complex disciplinary decision. Percival had directly violated clear orders while implementing changes that had proven tactically decisive and potentially strategically crucial to British naval operations. Military regulations demanded court-martial for such clear insubordination, but the result spoke louder than any disciplinary manual. Captain Montague's after-action report carefully documented the torpedo modifications' effectiveness while noting that they had been implemented without proper authorization or testing protocols. Admiral Horton's response reflected institutional ambivalence. Rather than ordering court-martial proceedings, he quietly arranged for Percival's transfer to the Royal Navy's Technical Development Section, where his modifications could be studied, refined, and officially implemented across the fleet. The transfer was accompanied by promotion to Chief Petty Officer and commendation for technical innovation under combat conditions, a language that acknowledged his success while avoiding explicit endorsement of insubordination. More importantly, Admiral Horton ordered immediate fleet-wide implementation of Percival's torpedo modifications, bypassing normal testing and approval procedures in recognition of their proven combat effectiveness. The official adoption of Percival's modifications transformed British torpedo effectiveness throughout the remaining Atlantic campaign. Statistical analysis revealed the dramatic scope of improvement. British submarine and destroyer torpedo success rates increased from 12% to 73% within 8 weeks of fleet-wide implementation, representing the most significant improvement in weapon effectiveness achieved during the entire war. The improved torpedo reliability enabled Allied naval forces to destroy German submarines at rates that fundamentally altered the Battle of the Atlantic's strategic balance, forcing Admiral Dönitz to withdraw his U-boat fleet from the mid-Atlantic hunting grounds where they had previously operated with near impunity. By December 1942, German submarine losses exceeded new construction for the first time since the war's beginning, marking the Battle of the Atlantic's turning point and ensuring continued Allied merchant shipping that was essential to British survival. Post-war analysis credited torpedo improvements with preventing an estimated 200,000 Allied merchant sailor deaths while preserving over 3 million tons of shipping that would otherwise have been lost to German submarine attacks. The modifications had proven strategically decisive in a manner that validated Percival's decision to ignore direct orders in pursuit of tactical effectiveness that military regulations had been preventing. Percival spent the war's remainder at Portsmouth, refining torpedo systems and developing other modifications that improved British naval capability. His official record described him as a technically innovative machinist with exceptional problem-solving abilities, language that acknowledged his contributions while diplomatically ignoring his tendency to ignore inconvenient regulations. He received the Distinguished Service Medal in 1944 for technical contributions to naval effectiveness, a citation that carefully avoided mentioning the specific modifications that had earned the recognition. More meaningfully, his torpedo improvements had been incorporated into standard Royal Navy technical procedures, ensuring that future weapons would function reliably without requiring individual machinists to risk court-martial for implementing necessary modifications. The war ended with Percival holding the rank of Warrant Officer First Class, commanding Portsmouth's Torpedo Development Workshop while training other technicians in the modification techniques that had proven so tactically decisive. The post-war years found Percival returning to civilian life with skills that had no obvious peacetime applications. He used his naval technical training to establish a small machine shop in Sheffield, specializing in precision mechanical work that attracted clients from across Britain's rebuilding industrial sector. His reputation for solving seemingly impossible mechanical problems drew customers who had exhausted conventional repair options. He married Margaret Whitworth, a teacher from nearby Rotherham, in 1946, and they raised 2 daughters in a modest house near his workshop. His family knew few details about his military service beyond his medal citation and his reluctance to discuss wartime experiences. His workshop walls displayed his naval commendation and several technical certificates, but no photographs or memorabilia that might have reminded visitors of the military context where his mechanical genius had proven strategically decisive. He lived quietly and deliberately, focusing on family and civilian work while maintaining the precision and attention to detail that had characterized his naval service. Letters from former shipmates occasionally arrived, maintaining connections forged during Atlantic convoy operations that had tested their courage and technical abilities. Commander Ashworth, promoted to admiral after the war, wrote annually to express gratitude for torpedo modifications that had enabled HMS Victorious to achieve tactical success during the convoy battles that proved decisive to Allied victory. His letters carefully avoided specific technical details that remained classified, but their tone made clear that he understood the full scope of Percival's contributions to British naval effectiveness. Other correspondence came from torpedo crews who had implemented his modifications on different vessels, reporting continued success and expressing appreciation for innovations that had saved their lives while enabling mission accomplishment under combat conditions. These letters represented the human dimension of technical innovation, connecting mechanical modifications to the lives saved and missions accomplished through improved weapon effectiveness. Documentary evidence of Percival's torpedo modifications eventually became available through declassified Royal Navy archives that were released during the 1990s, 50 years after the events they described. Technical reports, after-action summaries, and personal correspondence revealed the full scope of individual innovation that had proven strategically decisive during Britain's most critical military crisis. Historians studying the Battle of the Atlantic's turning point identified torpedo reliability as a crucial factor that had enabled Allied naval forces to regain tactical superiority over German submarine operations, directly connecting mechanical modifications to strategic outcomes that had determined the war's ultimate resolution. Academic studies published during the early 21st century explicitly credited unauthorized technical innovation with preventing British defeat, acknowledging that individual initiative had succeeded where institutional procedures had failed to address combat-critical weapon malfunctions. These studies vindicated Percival's decision to ignore direct orders in pursuit of tactical effectiveness, demonstrating that his insubordination had been strategically justified by results that proved essential to Allied victory. Modern naval personnel studying historical precedents for technical innovation under combat conditions consistently identify Percival Thornfield's torpedo modifications as a paradigmatic example of individual expertise overcoming institutional inflexibility to achieve tactically decisive results. His willingness to risk court-martial for implementing unauthorized improvements that restored weapon effectiveness has become a case study in military leadership programs that examine the tension between regulatory compliance and mission accomplishment. The Royal Navy's current technical procedures explicitly acknowledge that combat conditions may require modifications that exceed established authorization levels, incorporating lessons learned from wartime experience that demonstrated the strategic importance of tactical flexibility. The torpedo crisis of 1942 had revealed fundamental flaws in institutional procedures that prevented individual expertise from addressing combat-critical weapon failures, and post-war reforms incorporated those lessons to ensure that technical innovation would not require regulatory violations that could result in disciplinary action. The legacy of Percival Thornfield's torpedo modifications resonates through contemporary military history as an example of individual courage overcoming institutional inflexibility to achieve tactically decisive results that proved strategically essential. His willingness to risk court-martial for implementing unauthorized improvements demonstrated the importance of personal responsibility during organizational crisis, when individual expertise could provide solutions that institutional procedures were preventing. The case illustrates fundamental principles of military leadership that remain relevant to contemporary personnel facing similar tensions between regulatory compliance and tactical effectiveness under combat conditions. But the broader implications extend beyond military contexts to encompass civilian situations where individual knowledge creates obligations to act despite institutional resistance that may result from organizational limitations, bureaucratic inertia, or regulatory constraints that prevent necessary innovation. Would you have made the same choice? Would you have violated explicit orders from superior officers to implement unauthorized modifications that could theoretically have resulted in catastrophic explosions, court-martial, and strategic disadvantage? Would you have risked personal career destruction and criminal prosecution to restore weapon effectiveness that analysis suggested was essential to tactical success and strategic survival? The moral dimensions of Percival's decision transcend simple calculations of risk and benefit to encompass fundamental questions about individual responsibility during institutional crisis. When personal expertise creates obligations that may conflict with organizational authority and regulatory compliance. His unauthorized torpedo modifications had proven strategically decisive in ways that validated individual initiative while demonstrating the enormous consequences that could result from personal courage during critical historical periods. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means when institutional procedures conflict with tactical necessity, and strategic survival depends on individual willingness to accept personal risk for collective benefit.